Most people today associate the Twin Towers with the terrorist attack that destroyed them on September 11th, 2001. Not as many people are aware that the 9/11 attack was actually the second terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. On February 26, 1993, a bomb left inside a van parked in an underground parking garage went off at the World Trade Center near the North Tower. The explosion left behind a 5-story, 150 feet wide crater and injured over 1,000 people. The bombing killed 6 people, including Monica Rodriguez-Smith, who was late in her pregnancy with her first child, a boy she and her husband had named Eddie. The day of the bombing was her last day of work before she began her maternity leave. 6 Islamic fundamentalists were eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison for their involvement in the bombing, while a 7th has never been apprehended. The World Trade Center bombing came as a shock to most, but not to Rick Rescorla, the director of security for the financial firm Dean Witter, who worked out of the company's offices in the South Tower. As a veteran, Rick brought his years of military training to his job, requiring regimented performance from his security guards and constantly analyzing his surroundings, looking for threats. This only increased when the Gulf War began in 1990. He ultimately determined that the biggest threat to the World Trade Center was an unguarded entrance ramp to an underground parking garage near a load-bearing column. He ultimately was able to arrange a meeting with a security official with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which managed the World Trade Center. Rick explained the potential dangers of this soft spot in security, saying it will be easy for terrorists to bring in a truck bomb, which could cause serious structural damage. The official was not interested in Rick's assessment and told him to focus on security in the offices his company leased and nowhere else. When Rick's assessment was proven correct in 1993, panic broke out in the Dean Witter offices. Rick climbed onto a desk and threatened to drop his pants if everyone didn't calm down and pay attention. The other employees were stunned into silence and followed Rick's instructions for an orderly evacuation. Rick did not leave the building until it was completely evacuated. Following the 1993 attack, Rick began his own investigation into who could have been responsible for it, so as to improve security for his company's offices, bringing on his old friend from his military days, Dan Hill, to work as a consultant. They ultimately concluded that the threat of terrorism would only increase, and that the World Trade Center would almost certainly be targeted again. The Twin Towers were too symbolically significant as the highest buildings in New York City and an important symbol of American enterprise. While the 1993 attack did not bring down the Twin Towers as the terrorists had hoped, Rick believed that their failure would not deter others, who would eventually find a way to bring the towers down. He predicted that the next attack would come by air, with terrorists flying planes into the towers. He believed that the planes would most likely be cargo planes, potentially loaded with nuclear or biological weapons. Rick tried to convince the higher-ups at his company to move their offices from the World Trade Center to New Jersey. Since Manhattan was an island, it had limited points of exit in case of an emergency, and many employees were commuting in from New Jersey anyway. Real estate in New Jersey would be cheaper, and a campus featuring multiple buildings, each only a few stories tall and spread out from each other, would be a much less appealing target for attack. The company's lease at the World Trade Center was not set to expire until 2006, however, so Rick's advice was not followed. Rick therefore turned his attention to training the company's employees to respond to what he considered to be an inevitable future emergency with military precision. He developed a regimented evacuation plan in which employees would evacuate down the stairwells floor by floor in pairs of 2 in case someone fell and needed assistance. Rick insisted that full evacuation drills be carried out every few months, no matter how inconvenient their timing might be, and used a stopwatch to ensure everyone acted with the proper amount of urgency. These drills were not particularly popular. Rick did not particularly care. He did not tolerate the complaints or the jokes made about the drills, and participation in them was mandatory for everyone from the file clerks up to the highest levels of management. He would pull stockbrokers away from important trades and executives away from multi-million-dollar deals caring more about the preparedness of those he was responsible for than the quickly changing nature of the stock market. Rick remained with Dean Witter through its merger with Morgan Stanley, at which point the company became known as Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter & Co. By 2001, when the company renamed itself to simply Morgan Stanley, Rick held the position of Vice President of Corporate Security. Rick had been born Cyril Richard Rescorla in Hale, a port town in Cornwall, in the southwest of England. He left home in 1956 at the age of 16 to join the army. He enlisted in the British Army the following year, training as a paratrooper and then serving as an intelligence officer in Cyprus from 1957 to 1960. He then spent 3 years as a member of the Northern Rhodesia Police, serving as a police inspector with British colonial forces there. He then returned to the UK and joined the Metropolitan Police Service in London, but ultimately decided he was not ready to give up his life as a soldier. Rick's experiences with the British Army had left him with strong anti-communist sentiments. In light of the increasing conflicts in Vietnam, he determined that his best chance at fighting communist forces was by joining the American military. He came to America in 1963, going through basic training at Fort Dix in New Jersey, an officer cadet school at Fort Benning in Georgia. He graduated from the latter in April of 1965 as a second lieutenant. He was then assigned to lead a platoon in Bravo Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry and sent to Vietnam that fall. The first major battle between the United States Army and the People's Army of Vietnam was the Battle of Ai Drang in November of 1965. Rick's unit was sent into the Ai Drang Valley on the second day of fighting to replace the company who had arrived at a landing zone the day before and then been almost completely taken out during a firefight. Retired Army General Harold G. Moore would later describe Rick as the best platoon leader he ever saw. He was a ruthless and effective soldier who kept a sense of calm and purpose, even in the face of devastation. At night, as Rick made his way through what would come to be known as the Valley of Death to check on his men and ensure that they had supplies, he sang the Cornish folk songs of his youth. According to Bill Lund, who served with Rick, "We all thought we were going to die that night, and rescorla gave us our courage back. I figured if he's walking around singing, the least I can do is stop trembling." The following morning, the company successfully held off 4 separate assaults while sustaining minimal casualties. Rick's service in this battle was commemorated in a photograph of him that would later be used on the cover of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, a book by Harold Moore and Joseph Galloway about the battle. Rick soon became critical of how politicians were handling the war, and only served 1 tour in Vietnam, during which he earned a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and Bronze Stars for valor and meritorious service. He finished his time with the Army back at Fort Benning, and obtained his U.S. citizenship. As strong of a soldier as Rick was, there was more to him than his physical strength and calculating mind. He was highly intelligent and wrote poetry and eventually a screenplay. He had an interest in the arts and philosophy, researching various schools of each throughout his life, and was well versed in history. In 1968, Rick used his military benefits to begin classes at the University of Oklahoma. He earned both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in literature before going on to law school and becoming a criminal justice professor at the University of South Carolina. In 1972, Rick married his first wife, Elizabeth. The couple had a son and a daughter together. Their marriage ended in the mid-1990s, and the ensuing divorce became contentious, but the end of the marriage did not end Elizabeth's regard for Rick. Rick, in many ways, had a big personality, with little filter between what he thought and said, a tendency to be stubborn, and a lack of patience for those who did not meet his standards. However, Rick's personality could be over the top in positive ways as well. When later asked about her ex-husband, Elizabeth stated that she wanted him to be remembered for his kindness, which showed itself in both big and small ways. He once bought a co-worker an international plane ticket to go home after a death in her family. He shoveled the driveway of an elderly neighbor every time it snowed, and he visited an elderly blind man in a nursing home in Hale, every time he went back to his hometown to visit his mother. Rick ultimately came to dislike his life as a professor and turned to working in corporate security to utilize both his intellect and his military experience. Rick did not like to focus on his time in Vietnam and no longer felt like the soldier he once was, but the analytical skills he obtained during his years of military service had other applications. He had a few jobs in the field before coming to work for Dean Witter in 1985. The late 1990s brought a great number of significant events in Rick's life. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer that had spread to his bones and given 6 months to live. Despite his doctor's initial assessment, his cancer went into remission. In the ensuing years, he began studying Zen Buddhism and Greek philosophy. In February of 1999, he married his second wife, Susan. They had met the previous July while Rick was out jogging, and Susan questioned him as to why he was doing so barefoot. He replied that he needed to know how it felt to run without shoes on for a play he was writing. That play was based on his time in northern Rhodesia, where many of the residents regularly went barefoot. Rick was not supposed to be in the United States, much less at work, on September 11th, 2001. His stepdaughter was getting married in Italy, and he and his wife Susan had planned to arrive early so that they would have more time to spend in the country. Rick was going to take the full week of September 10th off, but his deputy also wanted that time off to visit family in Lebanon. Rick let him have those days off instead. Rick was therefore in his office on the 44th floor of the South Tower when American Airlines Flight 11 was flown into the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Initially, those inside the South Tower were ordered not to evacuate, with messages coming over the loudspeakers throughout the tower, telling everyone to stay where they were. Rick Rescorla did not care about what the official orders were. He immediately recognized that those in the South Tower were not safe, and began the evacuation he had forced Morgan Stanley's employees to practice so many times. Within minutes of the plane hitting the North Tower, thousands of Morgan Stanley employees working on the 44th to 74th floors of the South Tower began evacuating. 1,000 Morgan Stanley employees working in nearby Building 5 of the World Trade Center also began evacuating. While he was in the process of overseeing the evacuation, Rick made a short phone call to his old friend Dan Hill. He very colorfully expressed his frustration with the order not to evacuate, and the very colorful refusal he had given to the Port Authority when they gave him the order directly, by phone. He was going to get the employees he was responsible for to safety, regardless of how the Port Authority wanted him to handle the situation. At this point, Rick had no way of knowing that another plane would soon hit the South Tower. However, he did foresee that the North Tower would soon collapse, and according to what he told Dan Hill during his brief mid-evacuation phone call, he believed that the North Tower could take the South Tower down with it. Rick had correctly predicted that the Twin Towers would be attacked again following the 1993 bombing, and accurately anticipated many aspects of the plan terrorists enacted on September 11th. While he did not foresee every last detail correctly, or why evacuating when he did, despite the direction from the Port Authority, was necessary, he was correct in his assertion that evacuating from the South Tower immediately after the plane crashed into the North Tower was needed to save lives. By the time the South Tower was directly attacked at 9:03 a.m., just 17 minutes after the attack on the North Tower, all of Morgan Stanley's employees were in the process of evacuating, and many of them were already outside the building. According to witnesses, Rick remained calm as he oversaw the evacuation. He used a bullhorn to give instructions and handle problems. He also used it to reassure everyone. He told them that it was a good day to be proud to be an American, and that the whole world will be talking about them soon. He also sang over the bullhorn, singing both American patriotic songs like God Bless America and the Cornish songs of his youth, as he had done years before on the battlefields of Vietnam. After overseeing the evacuation of Morgan Stanley's employees in the South Tower, Rick did not evacuate himself. Instead, he remained inside the building looking for stragglers and people who needed help getting out. After Morgan Stanley's evacuation was complete, someone told him to get out of the building as well, to which Rick replied, "You hear those screams? There's more people up there. I have to help get them out." He was reportedly seen as high up as the 72nd floor, looking for people to help, working his way back down floor by floor. During this time, Rick called his wife Susan and told her, "Stop crying. I have to get these people out safely. If something should happen to me, I want you to know I've never been happier. You made my life." Shortly before the South Tower collapsed, a regional manager from Morgan Stanley saw Rick helping someone in the 10th floor stairwell. He told Rick he needed to get out of the building. Rick again promised he would leave as soon as everyone else was out of the building. He did not get the chance to before the tower collapsed. Rick had always been uncomfortable with any description of him or any other soldier who survived the Vietnam War as a war hero. He once told his wife Susan, "The real heroes are dead." By his own definition, Rick became a hero on September 11th, 2001, at the age of 62. Morgan Stanley had over 2,700 employees in the South Tower that day, and all but 6 of them survived, thanks in large part to Rick Rescorla's efforts on and before the day of the attack. 3 of the dead were Rick and his 2 security officers, who stayed back with him. Rick's body was never recovered from the rubble of the South Tower. He had always told his wife Susan he did not want a large funeral. He loved to visit a bird sanctuary in New Jersey, particularly to see the eagles in its care, and he had once asked Susan to make a donation to the sanctuary in his name if she wanted him memorialized in some way after his death. Susan honored this request, and a plaque honoring Rick was installed outside of the eagle cage. Rick has also been memorialized multiple times in both his native and adopted countries, with new honors still being bestowed upon him in 2023. On the first anniversary of his death, a granite memorial was unveiled across from his childhood home in Hale. The memorial was funded in large part by donations from members of the community. A family-owned brewery also brewed a special beer and gave the profits from its sale to the fund. In 2009, a memorial to Rick was unveiled along the Walk of Honor at the National Infantry Museum and Soldier Center at Fort Benning in Georgia. In 2019, Rick was posthumously awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal by President Trump. Susan Rescorla accepted the medal from him at the White House on Rick's behalf. That same year in England, the Great Western Railway named a new intercity express train after Rick, following his nomination for the honor by a public poll. In March of 2023, the Rick Rescorla Walkway was unveiled in Hale, along a section of seafront where Rick had played as a boy. Rick's children traveled to Cornwall for the dedication. While Rick did not desire a lot of attention for himself, it was very special for his children that he is still remembered in his hometown, which he remained so proud of throughout his life.